Why did Judas betray Jesus? This question has perplexed Christians for centuries, but I know why he did it. Judas betrayed Jesus because he wanted the Romans out of the Promised Land. He didn't understand who Jesus really was, and he actually had the guts to do something about that. If you want more content like this, click the like button and subscribe below. Judas wanted the Romans out of the Promised Land because that's what most Jewish people in the first century at the time of Jesus also wanted. The Romans under General Pompey conquered the Promised Land and Jerusalem in 63 AD, and this ended the Jewish independent period under the Maccabees. And from that day forward, the Jewish people were longing for God's kingdom to come in power and fullness, and for the Messiah to come and to deliver them out of the occupation of Roman soldiers and into the promises that God had for them. You see, this expectation many Jewish people had of kicking the Romans out was then fostered and cultivated and had a grassroots uprising through this Zealot movement. These Zealots were people who were incredibly nationalistic, and they were like a militia, if you will. They would go into markets and into public areas with daggers in their cloaks, and they would stab Roman soldiers and kill them in broad daylight. This Zealot movement eventually began to grow even beyond the time of Jesus. And in AD 66 to 73, the first Jewish revolt took place, which ultimately ended in the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And this fervor for Jewish independence did not stop there. There were two other successive Jewish independence movements, and they were both squashed by the Romans. And the last one, in 132 to 136 AD, finished their hopes once and for all. But during Jesus' time, this Zealot movement was quite small, yet noticeable and impactful. And Judas, by all intents and purposes, was a Zealot. He was a nationalistic Jewish person wanting the Romans to be kicked out of the Promised Land. All right, I need to make a clarification. It's not that all the disciples in Judas are all Zealots in the sense of stabbing people and killing people with daggers and stuff like that. One of the disciples is categorized as a zealot, but none of the rest. What I'm really saying is that they all had the aspirations for the Romans to get kicked out, and they were kind of like zealot light, if you will, where they had the hopes and dreams of a free nation and that God's kingdom would come, but they didn't know how that would take place. And Judas was a bit more aggressive, clearly, in the sense that he betrayed Jesus when he realized that Jesus wasn't going to do what he was going to do. And when Jesus came around, he saw the potential as Jesus as Messiah to fulfill that promise and to fulfill that expectation. But this leads me to my second reason. Judas didn't really understand who Jesus actually was. And to be honest, all of the disciples, for the most part, didn't really understand who Jesus was. I honestly think that Judas, along with all the other disciples, had the same expectations about Jesus. They wanted Jesus to kick out the Romans and to establish God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And when Jesus began to do some amazing things like teaching with authority and healing the sick and casting out demons and numerous other things like that, their excitement bubbled up, and they were thinking to themselves, is this going to be the person who kicks out the Romans, who's going to be our Messiah? It really looks like it. But Jesus also showed them some troubling expectations he had about himself that confused them. He would continually predict his death. He would teach them about how the first need to be last and the last need to be first. And he would say things like, we need to be servants. This really confused Jesus' disciples, but they continued to follow him. We see this confusion most clearly in Mark 10:35, where James and John come up to Jesus and ask if they can sit at his right and his left when he comes in glory. They were thinking of when Jesus is ruling on a throne in Jerusalem and the Romans are out. And Jesus knew they didn't really understand who he was and what he was up to. Jesus was really thinking about his death and resurrection in that time of glorification, not him on a throne of human origins. And Jesus' disciples would not truly understand who he really was until after his death and resurrection. But it was only Judas who had the guts to actually betray Jesus, because he had a clearer understanding of who Jesus actually was. And this is the controversial opinion. Judas actually knew that Jesus was saying things that countered his expectations. And as this impending crucifixion seemed imminent, Judas took matters into his own hands. Judas knew that Jesus' vision of the future was counter to a zealot's vision of the future for Jerusalem. I don't think Judas was the only disciple who was capable of betraying Jesus, but he was the only one who saw the writing on the wall. In a sense, it was good that the disciples didn't understand who Jesus actually was, and they were given a chance to reflect after his death and resurrection on who he was, so that the gospel could be preached through them. I'm not making an excuse for Judas. It was clearly wrong that he betrayed Jesus, but he was acting incredibly consistently with his ideology and with his expectations of who the Messiah would be, and he had a very clear understanding of who Jesus was. Not the clearest of understandings as God, the Son of God, the true Messiah. He saw Jesus as somebody who wasn't the Messiah in the sense that he was looking for, and he was right about that. So there you go. Judas betrayed Jesus because he wanted the Romans out of the promised land. He didn't understand who Jesus really was as the Son of God and Messiah. But he actually had the guts to do something about it because he understood that Jesus wasn't the Messiah he was looking for. Thanks for watching, and if you want more content like this, please hit the like button and subscribe below. And YouTube is probably recommending right now a video that they think you'll like of mine.